Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa ahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Tayyib, alhamdulillah. So far we've mentioned the word kafara many times, alhamdulillah. And I think now is a befitting time for us to talk about the kafara. Kafara is essentially a punishment or a major expiation for violating the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is something that you have to do if you break your fast on purpose in 5 circumstances only. So we spoke about many conditions in the last lesson, but today we're going to put everything in one place which is to do with the kafara. And there's 5 circumstances that you need to pay attention to. So what are these 5 circumstances where you have to do this thing called a kafara? The first circumstance is if you intend not to fast when you should be fasting in Ramadan. Sometimes there are people who live in their ignorance and they just say that they refuse to fast and they make that intention before Fajr and then they follow through with that intention. They don't actually fast. This is pure ignorance, and this day would need to be made up and a kafara would need to be done too. However, if that person realizes their mistake before Fajr and they fix their intention, then no kafara is needed and the fast would be valid. But the point is that if they make a fast or an intention before Fajr that they're not going to fast when they should be fasting because it's Ramadan, then they would need to make up that day and do a kafara too. So that's the first circumstance. The second circumstance, very easy. If you eat on purpose. You guys know that if you're fasting, you shouldn't eat, okay? If you eat on purpose and there's no reason for it whatsoever, then you have to make up that day and do a kafara as well. Similarly, the third circumstance is drinking. If you drink on purpose, then you have to make up that day and do a kafara because you shouldn't be drinking when you're fasting. The fourth circumstance, very easy as well, is if you have intercourse with your spouse. If you have intercourse with your spouse, then you have to make up that day as well and do a kafara. And finally, the fifth circumstance is if you ejaculate on purpose, release mani on purpose from other than intercourse. Now, we defined last lesson what on purpose means. If you know that with things like foreplay, for example, the things that lead to intercourse, or that if you look at something, or you touch something, or you think about something, that it will lead to ejaculation, and you do it, and you do ejaculate, then you do have to do qada, which is making up that day, and you have to do a kafara on top of that as well. So these are the 5 situations in which a kafara is needed. So the $1 million question, what is the kafara? The kafara for Ramadan is one of 3 things that you can do, and you have the choice to do whichever one you want. The first one is fasting 2 months in a row for every day that you break under these 5 circumstances. The second is pretty serious. The second option is freeing a sound Muslim slave. But to be honest, this doesn't really exist anymore today. And the third reason is, or the third kind of kafara, if you like, that you can do, is feeding 60 needy people by giving them a meal or giving them about 1 kilogram of grain, like rice or something like that. 60 of them. That is the kafara. As you can see, it's a major expiation because it is a big violation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Maliki madhab, or Imam Malik himself, he preferred feeding 60 people over the other 2 options that you have. That's the preference of Imam Malik in our madhab, okay? With all that said, there are 2 exceptions where no kafara is needed if you end up eating or drinking on purpose, okay? There are 2 exceptions, and this will complete everything you need to know with regards to kafara. The first one is if you were forced to break your fast. Otherwise, if you don't break your fast, there would be a big harm that would come to you, or you might even lose your life. Right? If that happens and you're forced to, because otherwise you might lose your life or there's a big harm related to you, then you can break your fast and you just have to make that day up with no kafara. So let me give you an example so you can see the severity. Let's say you're at work and you have a boss who hates Muslims, and he threatens to fire you unless you eat there and then, just to annoy you. Now, this alone is not a good enough reason for you to break your fast, by the way, because you can just find a new job. But if you know that if you were to be fired right now, you do not have the means to provide for your family and you'd be left on the streets, right? If you cannot find a new job, or until you find a new job, then you can eat, and it would be a measurable enough harm. But there has to be a very, very big harm for you to class as this first exception, okay? So that's just an example, and we'll leave it at that, inshallah, so that we don't get too much into it. The second exception is if you think that what you've done is fine based on some sort of evidence, right? So for example, if you eat on purpose because you're traveling. Now, we're going to mention later that traveling is a valid reason to break your fast, but it must be more than 77 kilometers at least, or 48 miles. But if you travel a bit less, like 60 kilometers, and you think you're fine, so you just break your fast like that, then you fall under one of those circumstances, right? Because you've eaten. However, because you have thought that you've done something right because of some sort of evidence that traveling does break the fast, then no kafara is needed. You just need to make that day up. Another example is, we mentioned in the first lesson that if you, the moon is seen on Yawm al-Shak, so after Fajr, a person who eats after finding that the moon was, sighted after Fajr, right? He's done wrong, and we said that they need to do a kafara, right? But if he thinks that he's fine to continue eating because he already ate after Fajr, then this is something where he just needs to make up that day with no kafara because he didn't know, right? And he thought that because he's eaten and broken his fast already, that, he didn't have to basically continue his fast until the end of the day, okay? So that's everything you need to know about the kafara. Now we can move on to the next section, which is known as a fidya. A fidya, I don't know the best way to explain it, but it's like a compensation. It's like a compensation that you make for missing a fast for a specific reason. Now, the fidya is just feeding one needy person a meal. That's all it is. That's all the fidya is. You just feed one needy person a meal. And there's 4 situations where you have to do a fidya, okay? So the first 5 were for the kafara. Now we're going to talk about 4 situations where a fidya is needed. The first situation is if you allow a new Ramadan to pass before making up the fasts from the previous Ramadan. So let's say you have 3 days, 4 days that you have to make up from a Ramadan. If you allow a full Ramadan to pass before you make up those 4 days, then you have to make up those days and pay a fidya for every single day that you make up. And you would be sinful if you actually wait until the next Ramadan to make those fasts up. So make sure you make your fasts before Ramadan starts the new one, right? But if, however, you intend, and this is an exception, so pay attention. If you intend to make up the days that you have left in the month of Sha'ban, which is the month before the new Ramadan, and this is what Aisha radiallahu anha used to do, right? If you intend to do the same, there's no problem with that at all. But let's say you fell ill in Sha'ban and you couldn't make those days up because you fell ill and you had the intention to, but you couldn't because you were too ill. Then no fidya is needed because you have a valid kind of excuse, if you like, right? So that's the first circumstance. The second circumstance is if you are a woman who is breastfeeding and you're worried about your child. Now, sometimes when a sister is fasting, her breast milk can be affected, right? So if a sister is in that situation, then she can break her fast if she meets 2 conditions. The first condition is that there is no one else that can breastfeed the child. If she can't find anyone else to breastfeed the child, then she's ticked the first condition. But the second condition is, let's say there is other people, but the child refuses their milk and only wants the milk of the mother. Then if you tick those 2 boxes and you fear for the child, then you can break your fast. All right? But really the befitting thing to do with the age of doctors, especially if we're in the West, is to check with a doctor and say, look, should I break my fast or do you think my baby will be fine? And he'll tell you. And if he says you should break your fast, then inshallah that's also the green light for you to do so. Okay? But if you do break your fast because you're breastfeeding, then you make that day up, you do qada, and you pay the fidya. That's the second circumstance. The third circumstance is if you get very, very old, may Allah protect you all, and it gets to a point where if you fast, you might die, or you might get severely ill, right? For such a person, they don't need to fast at all, okay? And it is mustahab, which means liked, to pay a fidya for every day they missed. But even then, they don't even need to pay a fidya. But there's an important distinction. If that person is able to fast, but in the colder winter days, which are shorter and colder and cooler and easier for the body, if they can do that, but they can't do the current Ramadan, then they do not pay fidya, but they make up all 30 days in winter. You see? So I'll repeat that one more time. If someone has reached a very old age and they cannot fast Ramadan because it's too hot and the days are long, but they're able to fast in the winter where the days are shorter and colder, then they can wait until then and they don't even need to pay fidya. However, if they cannot fast all year round, then it is mustahab, it is liked for them to pay a fidya for every day that they've missed, which is feeding one miskeen, one needy person, one meal for every day of fast that they miss, which would be 29 or 30 days, okay? So that's the third circumstance. And finally, the fourth circumstance when it comes to fidya is if you become so thirsty that you can no longer be patient and you need water, otherwise there will be a harm that comes your way and you might even pass away. That level is a very high level of thirst. If you reach that level, then yes, you can break your fast and it would only be mustahab for you to pay your fidya too. It's not something that you have to do either. It's not a wajib. It's just mustahab. So that summarizes the four circumstances with regards to fidya. So now we've done the kafara, which has 5 circumstances. And we've done the fidya, which is 4 circumstances. In both of those circumstances, or both of those fidya and kafara, you have to make up the fasts and either do a kafara or do a fidya. Now we move on to the third section, okay, where there's no kafara and no fidya, but there's only just qada, making up the missed fast. For that, there is 7 situations. And we'll go through them one by one, inshallah ta'ala. The first one is if you break your fard fast in Ramadan with A, a valid reason, or B, you do something on accident that you shouldn't do. So for example, a valid reason would be menstruation. If a sister starts her cycle, then she's missed a day, right? And she's missed a few days. And on accident, an example of that would be maybe forgetting to set an intention, or maybe releasing mani on accident, right? As we've defined last lesson. If you break your fard fast as an accident by doing something you shouldn't do, or a valid reason, for example, menstrual cycle, then you just make that day up, okay? And there's no fidya needed. Simple as. Second circumstance, and this is specific to the Maliki madhab as we're going to mention. If you break your nafil fast for no reason, then you would be sinful, okay? And you would need to make up that fast, but with no fidya. You see, Malikis, they see fasting as an act of worship. And so they say that if you start an act of worship for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the befitting thing is to see it through until the very end. So if you have no reason to end it, then you shouldn't end it. And if you do end it, then you would be sinful and you'd need to make that day up because you intended to do that act of worship. But the point is that if you do that, there is no kafara, no fidya. However, you would need to make that day up, even though it's a nafil, because you had no reason to break it. But with that said, if you do have a valid reason, then you don't need to make up the nafil fast. If you actually have a valid reason to break your nafil fast, you don't need to make it up. So for example, let's say your parents call you for food. They want you to eat with them. Of course, as you guys know, that obeying your parents is a wajib. But your fast is a nafil. So of course the wajib overtakes the nafil and you would answer to your parents. A second scenario is if a husband asks his wife to break her fast. Again, because obeying the husband is a wajib, it overtakes the fact that the nafil, the fast is a nafil. And really, if a sister who is married would like to fast a nafil, she should seek permission from her husband first, as the fuqaha have mentioned. Okay? And those are just 2 examples that I've given, but basically anything to that very high level would be sufficient for you to break your fast. But if it's something like, for example, your friends, they invited you, that's not a good enough reason in the Maliki madhab. Okay? Because it's not a good enough reason for you to leave this act of worship that you've started for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But as I mentioned, whenever there is an important kind of thing that people are used to, I would look into all the other madhahib for you. And actually the Malikis, in regards to this matter, they go against all the other madhahib. All the other madhahib do actually allow you to break your nafil fast for no reason, with no making up for those days needed either. Okay? But a lot of the scholars, they do see it as makruh from the other madhahib as well. So it is something that's disliked, so it's not good practice to do. But nevertheless, it's allowed for all the other madhahib, but the Malikis are strict with this. Okay? The third circumstance is swallowing phlegm. Now, a lot of people ask this question. You know that liquid that forms behind your nose? if you swallow it, let's say you produce something, a lot of it because you're a bit ill or something like that, and you start swallowing your phlegm throughout the day, according to the book that we're studying, okay, this actually does break your fast. But this opinion is weak. Even if you swallow phlegm on purpose, the correct opinion is that it does not break your fast. This is the stronger opinion. So you follow this one, inshallah, okay? But if you do have the ability to spit it out, then that would be better. Just make sure you're in an environment where there's no one there that can look at you, because it's pretty disgusting, as you can imagine. And if you're able to spit out, inshallah, in a place where it can be cleaned and whatnot, okay? So that's the third circumstance. The fourth circumstance, where no fidya or kafara is needed, is if you doubt Fajr has started, or you doubt that Maghrib has started, and you choose to eat or hold back depending on the situation you're in. Let's say you don't have access to a masjid or a timetable, and you're looking at the sky and you have no idea if Fajr started, okay? If you don't know if Fajr has started, then you should stop eating right away from that moment. If you choose to eat, then you have to make up that day, because if you have shak, if you have doubt, then this won't be accepted. But there will be no fidya. Remember, this is all the stuff to do with no fidya, no kafara, right? Same applies for Maghrib. If Maghrib has started, if you doubt Maghrib has started, okay, then you should wait until you're 100% sure and then break your fast. But if you break your fast when you have shak, when you have doubt, then you would need to make up that day with no fidya or no kafara either. Does that make sense? So that's the fourth circumstance. I hope you guys are following along well, inshallah, because this is a meaty class, but it'll give you everything you need, inshallah. The fifth circumstance, okay, is if you break your fast when you are pregnant and you're worried for your child. Now, typically, you should see a doctor and just be like, look, I'm pregnant. Should I fast? Should I not fast? If he says don't fast, you're good to go, okay? You just make those days up. There's no fidya. But if you cannot see a doctor and you're worried for your child, then it's fine. You can still break your fast. The Maliki scholars have allowed this. But again, with this said, all right, the book that we're studying also says that you do need to do a fidya, but again, this opinion is weak. So that's why I've put it in this section where no fidya, no kafara is needed, okay? So if you choose to, as a pregnant woman, to not fast because you actually genuinely fear for your child, then inshallah, you just make those days up, no fidya required, everything is good to go, all right? Situation number 6 is if you have a severe sickness. Okay, if you have a sickness where, and by the way, the Malikis, they're strict with this. You have to be very, very sick, and you're worried that by fasting you're going to get worse, or even if you're very, very ill and you don't know if you're going to get worse or not, then you can break your fast and make up that day. It's something you have to do with no fidya, no kafara. And if you're unsure if your sickness is strong enough and you're unsure if you're going to get worse by fasting, then again, you should see a doctor. But again, look at your body. You'll know if you're weak enough to fast, or if you fast, you might be worse off, okay? Tayyib. And finally, number 7, if you travel more than 48 miles or 77 kilometers, which is the same distance, just converted for you, then you are allowed to break your fast. When can you break your fast? Can you just break your fast in the morning because you plan to travel? No, you have to leave your area or locality, okay? If you're in an airport, as soon as you get the boarding pass, it's almost like you have left your locality. So you can start doing your, you can start breaking your fast from there. Or if you get into a car, then leave your city essentially, and then you can break your fast. But with that said, there's something that you need to know, that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions in the verse traveling and fasting, okay, He says, وَأَن تَصُومُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. If you were to fast, that would be better for you if only you knew. So the reality is that if you do travel, it is better for you to fast if you're able to fast. If it's a short distance, few hours, or something, even if it's on a plane, if you think that you can fast, it would be better for you to fast, as Allah says in the Quran. And that summarizes everything to do with no kafara and no fidya. So if you guys think back, there's 5 circumstances for kafara, 4 circumstances for the fidya, and 7 circumstances for no kafara or no fidya. And this is something that, inshallah, if from this moment all the way back to the beginning of the course, you guys are now masters of the rulings of fasting. But there are a few things that we need to speak about, which is a very, very commonly asked question. The reality is that last few sessions might have shocked you. You might have realized that you have made many mistakes in the past and you actually did some things which invalidated your fast which you didn't previously know about. You might have realized that, and we had a few questions yesterday about this. Now that we've actually finished all the rulings about what makes a fast valid or invalid and whether there's a kafara or fidya involved or neither of them, what should you do with these invalid fasts that you might have made in the past? Maybe, for example, you weren't a very pious person and you missed fasts on purpose, in your times of ignorance. Maybe you did a mistake continuously thinking it was fine. So for example, yesterday the brother asked us, he said that he was throwing up on purpose, to make his belly feel better during fasting. What should you do in that case if you've identified that there are actually a few days where you've messed up? Take this as a general principle, okay? Now that you guys know the ruling, now that you guys know the ruling, and you've identified that you have invalid fasts, you have to make those days up. You have to. But then there's two scenarios. The first scenario, if you knew about the kafara related to the thing that invalidated your fast, or the fidya related to the thing that invalidated your fast, then you have to do them for every missed fast. So if you missed a couple of years of fasting because you were ignorant and you knew about the kafara, then you have to do, unfortunately, a kafara for every single one of those days for those years that you missed fasting. And you have to make those days up as well. And the second scenario is if you didn't know about the kafara or fidya, because this is all new to you, right? If you didn't know about the kafara or fidya, and you only just knew that what you did invalidated your fast after all this knowledge you gained, then you just have to make those days up and you don't have to do the kafara and you don't have to do the fidya. But then some people might ask the question, what if I don't remember how many days that I didn't fast? That's where you guess a minimum amount of days and a maximum amount of days, and you go with the maximum and you make the maximum up. How do you make it up? After Ramadan, you can fast every Monday and Thursday, for example, with the intention of qada. You can fast, more days than that if you like. No problem at all. We're going to talk about the different times which are good to fast as well in the next lesson. It's your choice. The quicker the better, of course, but so long as you have the intention to make up those days, then just keep it steady and make them finish, inshallah ta'ala. Okay? And there is one more situation I want to speak about to complete the rulings, inshallah. And it's actually off the back of a comment that I got on one of the videos, the previous lessons that I put on YouTube. And this is for reverts. There was actually a revert in the comments section. It's a good question for you guys to know about so that you can help others and you can help yourself as well, inshallah. There was a revert that said, it's my first month of fasting coming up. This is my first Ramadan, okay? Can I break my fast because I fear how my parents are going to react? We've kind of already answered it in this class already, but I'll mention it again. Unless you have a severe harm coming your way, severe harm, and being kicked out of your house is not good enough of a harm because you can always find something and you can do something about it. But if there's a genuine severe harm coming your way and you even fear death, okay, then you can break, but otherwise you have to fast. And this principle doesn't just apply to reverts, it applies to any situation where there's a great harm or there's some sort of death involved or anything like that. The reality is that fasting is an act of worship, especially in Ramadan. It's an obligation and a pillar of Islam set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the best thing to do is to fast and have certainty that you have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by your side. Whatever difficulty you guys face, whatever the reaction of the parents are going to be, whatever you go through, know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is your protector and that life is a test. If things go bad, then فَإِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا. Indeed, with hardship comes ease. And Allah repeats that to affirm that for you as well, okay? And perhaps for the revert, the persistence in fasting, despite their bad reaction, might be the very thing that opens their hearts to Islam. You never know. And so with that said, we wrap up inshallah the class. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Jazakumullah khairan. Let's take some questions inshallah. Barakallahu feekum.